Despite intensive trade talks during the past 2 months, Donald Trump has decided to impose 25% tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Tariffs affecting more than 800 products worth $34 billion in annual trade are due to come into effect on July the 6th. And China has announced its retaliation on the same scale and includes agricultural products, cars and marine products also taking effect from July the 6th. So far, if a trade war between the world's two largest economies has indeed broken out, where will the situation take us in the immediate future? How will it undermine businesses on either side and in the rest of the world? And who will suffer the most in the battle? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Wang Yong from Peking University, Mr. Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, and Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. So, gentlemen, China has announced its retaliation list, mainly focusing on U.S. agricultural products and automobiles. What do you make of China's response so far, Professor Liu?
Well, China's response is reactive. Well, because China charted out two alternatives. One is that, okay, we do our best through negotiations, through dialogue, and even through compromise to go for a win-win situation, because the trade war will hurt everybody, not only the United States and China, but also the whole world economy when it's still in a period of fragile recovery. So that's the responsibility of a big nation, that China is trying to send a message to the world. But China is also prepared, and therefore they lose no time for the second alternative by retaliating, because this is the thing that actually the White House has invited China to do that. So, and also the lack of integrity and the rupture of all the consensus will, lead to such a sort of unfortunate situation. So I think China is also loaded with more bullets. So therefore, let's see how things develop. So the key issue is that whether Donald Trump is using it as an instrument, or he just sees a sort of intrinsic value in punishing China, because this is really totally against the WTO rules, and the unilateralism will really send a very bad image of the United States under his leadership.
Right, Mr. Dunham, just as Professor Liu mentioned, the two countries actually earlier reached a consensus that the two countries should talk about this rather than, jump into trade frictions or even trade war against each other. But Trump's change of mind is not a surprise yet. A little bit surprising part, I think, is his statement, official statement. It's on the White House's website. In that statement, he accused China of tax theft as a main reason for him to do this, and he even said if China retaliates, he will pursue, extra tariffs against China. What do you make of such a statement?
When I read the statement on the White House website, I thought, this is ghost-written by Peter Navarro. He's the very hawkish trade advisor that President Trump has, who created a movie called Death by China. And I think, the words coming out of Trump in the past have been both ways. We're ready for a war. During the campaign, he said 45% tariffs on China. But then he also said they're ready to negotiate. But I think that the winners in the White House in the battle are the protectionists who want to go to war with China. Lighthizer, the trade representative, and Navarro. And I think that they're running the show right now. And I think that Trump actually believes that China will back down. And I think in that way, there's no historical precedent of China backing down in a situation like this.
Listening to these terms, trade wars, tariffs, Robert Lighthizer, it sounds like we're getting back to the 1980s, right, Professor Wang?
Yes, I think the situation is quite worrisome, frankly speaking.
And a little bit outdated, I'm afraid.
Yes, I think driven by this outdated the thinking about trade. Yes, that is, we are in the age of economic globalizations. Our economy is interdependent, right? So now the Trump and his team has launched the trade war against everybody. I think even including close allies, right? So that is our easily remind the people we are coming into the era of the Great Depressions. We know the consequences of Great Depressions in the 1930s, right? So that is the U.S. Congress kick off the high level tariff war against all these major economies. And there will be got retaliations by Europe and by Japan, about all the industrialized countries then. And what we have to wait, okay, that is the fatal war, not the World War II. Yeah, so we should be very careful about it. We should make it, open and the issues, okay, to the the public, so in the United States, and we should use the WTO, the United Nations as arenas, okay, to discuss about the political and economic consequences.
But right now, President Trump seems very unwilling to resort to the WTO mechanism. Why is that? Will the U.S. eventually, withdraw from the WTO?
I don't think that we'll go that far during the Trump presidency, but he has a deep distrust of international institutions. He wants the United States to dictate policy. He does not want to be part of consensus building, and he wants one-on-one negotiations. He views himself as the great negotiator, and he thinks that that's where he's the most effective, one-on-one. To underscore the points just made, I really do think this is an outdated worldview in several ways. One is the whole idea of a trade deficit. Trade deficits are out of date in an era of globalization where products go from country to country to country. President Trump is claiming trade deficit based on products that are shipped from China to the U.S., but they're products that have been made, parts in the United States, parts in South Korea, parts in Japan, put together in China, then shipped back to the U.S. So that number is off, and I really do think that he's thinking in an old way. And 60% of the goods shipped from China to America have American-made products, are partly made in America. So I think just the simplicity of saying China is cheating us with Chinese-made products is just very much an oversimplification.
So, Professor Liu, what's the current way? What's the modern way to deal with disputes like this?
Well, theoretically, there are three choices for solving a dispute. One is that communication. You openly propose your agenda and put all your difficulties or challenges on the table for frank discussion. So that's the best way. The other is that you go to a arbitrator or go to a jury, say, okay, let the third party decide. And third is go to the war. So war is most destructive, but arbitration or litigation is justifiable, but it's expensive. So communication is the best way. But the basis for communication is that you got to be honest, you got to be consistent, and you got to be very frank. So if you really want to trick the other, and the retaliation can even make the situation even worse.
What about a structural perspective? Because Trump has said so many times about the U.S. trade deficit to China due to Chinese goods, cheap goods. But what about the service sector? Actually, in this particular sector, the United States has a huge trade surplus from China. So that's the thing he never mentioned openly.
Well, of course, on the balance sheet, if you talk about the surplus in service enjoyed by the current calculation, it doesn't really offset the trade deficit the U.S. Suffers from China's export. But the entire equation is pretty much at stake. Actually, early in the last century, there was a joint growth between China and the United States under the GCCT to ascertain as how to calculate. As Professor Wang mentioned, the entire value chain is different. So in terms of the added value, in terms of the transshipment. So if you really deduct those that merely transshipment or those that are made by the United States companies in China, so the figure is not that large. So therefore, we need really to go back to do the calculation instead of simply focusing on offsetting each other.
And talking about added value part, I think that's one sticky point in the whole negotiation between the two countries, right? When you talk about added value, it's about technology, it's about brand value, and that's China not very good at the moment, but the U.S. is very good at this. So in his statement, Trump also said made in China 2025 is a major concern. He said this is to dominate technology in the future and it will hurt U.S. How come one country's technological strategy hurt another country? Do you think this his statement can stand on this regard, Professor Wang?
Yes, I think that is one of the question. Okay, the U.S. the Trump especially are concerned about China. He accused China of conducting unreasonable and justified discriminatory treatment of the U.S. goods and investment. Right, so that is one of the main targets. I think is about China's plan. Okay, the Made in China 2025. Okay, China, its policy, industrial incentive. To help Chinese company to grow up, right? So I think that is.
So you're saying that basically the United States and Donald Trump are saying that
right.
China cannot develop unless I agree, I allow you to. Is that the case?
Well, I think what I see here is the trade hawks deciding that they don't want Made in 2025 to succeed because the goal of that is independence in Chinese companies and technology. Right now, China is dependent on foreign technologies, particularly from the United States, and the government of China has seen the U.S. government blocking Chinese entry into the market to gain the skill expertise in a multinational way. And China has decided we need to have all of this done here so we are not dependent on any other country, the vagaries of international politics. And I think that's what Peter Navarro and the hawks in the White House want to kill before it's born. Because once that happens, I think it becomes far easier for China to compete on a tech level. I mean, you've had Chinese companies struggling in the international market on phones, for example. But if Made in China 2025 succeeds, that's going to change the equation for multinational competition in the decade ahead.
Yes, I think China also needs to do a reflection because in order to boost the confidence of the Chinese people and the Chinese businessmen, well, we spoke a lot, very loudly about, the moving to the mid and high-end manufacturing area by 2025. We're going to move from roughly 10% to 60% of the whole, 63% of the whole world top-end manufacturing. So that really scared not only the United States but also the developed world. And are we really able to go for that, to really reach that target? And also, are we really talking about zero-sum game? So I think the world needs further clarification as China is moving in a more positive sum game, and China is willing to work with the developed world in particular to move ahead instead of fighting for a fixed piece of pie. So that's something that China, in terms of the the media or even propaganda work, so we need really to reflect on us.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll continue this after a short break. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. So, gentlemen, let's talk about the big picture and continue our earlier discussion regarding technological development. One theory about human history of industrialization is that it's due to technological transfer from advanced countries to less advanced countries, and eventually less developed countries will have their own indigenous technology. Therefore, all countries can prosper due to technology. Do you think this case still stands in the 21st century and between China and America?
Definitely. Actually, this is really driven by what is called the production life cycle on an international basis. So actually, they are motivated not only by those receiving end, but by those exporting end, because the developed world, when for example, they develop a technology and new products in the home market in the first place, but gradually the technology loses its cutting edge advantage, so they're going to revive the product life cycle in a less developed world, so that forms a waterfall impact. And the fact that China received all the manufacturing capacity given its demographic dividend and given its lower environmental standard and lower price in land concessions, etc. But now China is experiencing the same thing. Now, many Chinese companies or joint venture companies with foreign companies are shifting more of the manufacturing capacity for the same reason to Cambodia, to Myanmar. So that's the whole waterfall effect, so that forms a cycle. But of course, that reversed the whole payment system. So the developed world used to export those high-tech stuff, but in the end, when it becomes more generic, and also when it becomes more labor-intensive, and then they become the importer of those stuff, but at far cheaper level. So that's the whole cycle that really at work. It's still valid.
Right. Having said that, the United States right now is at more trade hostility with nearly all its neighbors, allies, and world's major economies. Why is that, Mr.
Well, Donald Trump thinks that the world is unfair to him. I mean, he's picked on Canada, the closest American ally forever.
That means the richest guy in the neighborhood is playing victim here.
Exactly, and Canada has a trade deficit with the U.S. The U.S. It sends more to Canada than Canada sends to the U.S. I mean, Donald Trump was threatening to blow up NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, unless Canada and Mexico agreed to concessions. I mean, he really disagrees with the concept of European integration, and I mean, he's gone right after the American allies. And in fact, there were stories last week that Germany has developed or is developing an American strategy, how to deal with Trump's America, the same way as they have a Russian strategy on how to deal with Putin. I think that Europe and Britain separately have to come up with strategies, because he is not going to be a partner. We're not going to see increasing multilateral trade. Trump wants one-on-one deals, and he'd much rather deal with Britain, I think, than deal with the European Union. I mean, before his tariffs on China, he had punished U.S. allies far more than the, quote, adversary in trade. He had punished South Korea and Japan as well before any tariffs were implemented on China.
And Professor Wang, just as you mentioned, this is the age of economic globalization, and Trump's thinking simply doesn't work in the current global value chain. Tell us more about how the global value chain works nowadays.
Yes, I think the trade war between U.S. and China, U.S.-China as the two largest economies in the world, but the U.S. and China the trade relations, I think that is a very symbol of the industrial integrations across the countries. Okay, that is the stories of the rise of global value chain. Right, so that is China, as as a place, as a workshop, right? So the neighboring economies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, of China, or Singapore, right? So move the assembly lines to China. And see the Chinese workers and Chinese factories use do the final procession job and re-export to the markets of developed countries, right? So that is if U.S.-China trade relations break off, all this inter-military assembly lines of the companies will suffer greatly. Okay, so I think that is will send a big impact, okay, to the economies in the region. So China is not, the only the victim. All the economies in Asia, okay, will suffer.
So, Professor Liu, will Donald Trump take this to another level? And if he will, is China ready for that?
That is his bluffing technique. So therefore, I would think this is more instrumental than intrinsic. So yes, he told to the press that okay, now we have another 100 billion hanging on the in the air, and also by the end of the June, there can be possibly more restrictions on Chinese investment over there. And also there can be tightened scrutiny over the high-tech export to China, and so on and so forth. But can the U.S. businesses and the consumers allow him to go that far? And also, can the whole world now is getting the same allied the sentiment against him, allow him to go that far? So I would say, okay, China is reactive, but China has its own strategic moves. And also that he has to be aware that Chinese people are rather resilient over anything. So any type of harsh time. But so the fact that you can see that the list of punishment is rather different. So therefore, he is trying to avoid the negative impact on his constituency, but that's his Achilles heels that China and the rest of the world are really targeting at. So therefore, can he politically, at home, sustain to really to go, as he wishes? So that's a big question mark.
And talking about pressure, the American Chamber of Commerce and U.S. National Retail Federation, as well as the Soybean Association, have spoken out against Trump's latest tariff moves against China. Do you think the pressure is enough right now?
No. Donald Trump has shown no sign of ever backing down when U.S. business goes up against him. And the Republicans in Congress have just rolled over. The Republicans in Congress have been more critical of these tariffs than Democrats, but they have never taken Trump on. They've never passed legislation saying, you can't do this, President Trump. So I think right now, though, you look at the tariffs, look at what China did, look at what Canada did, look what EU did. It's all politically directed to aim at key constituency groups, to try to get, the Chinese tariffs, to try to get business to put pressure on the White House. The Canadians and the Europeans aimed at the top Republican leaders, Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin motorcycles for the House and Senate leaders. So I think what we're seeing right now is that the countries are trying to put political pressure on Trump in the U.S. first. Secondly will be the impact on American consumers and a public revolt, because one study showed that the tariffs that Trump imposed on China will cost an average American family $80 a month, and the Chinese tariffs will cost $200 a month. So this is a big tax increase for an average American.
And talking about Canada, the United States is actually citing a Cold War era domestic law opposing imports from Canada as a national security threat to the U.S. Should other countries be alarmed that the U.S. is citing domestic law in trade disputes like this, which could, be solved under the WTO mechanism?
Yes, I think there is. The U.S. has a very complicated system, of the trade laws. Right, and the U.S. politicians, they used to, to make laws as instruments in building the pressures on the other countries. Right, so that it has made such a complicated system of laws about trade. Right, so the national security is one excuse, right? So that is, as Canadian pointed, it's ridiculous to accuse the country like Canada as a national security threat, right? So, but China, I think that is same thing, right? The U.S. China has engaged in about $100 billion US dollars trade. Okay, the trade in service and trade in goods combined. Okay, that has surpassed any pair of trade relations in the histories. That means U.S. and China, all the major economies, has they high the stakes. So in the relations, in the maintain the stability of these relations. Now I think that is with the forthcoming of trade war, with very serious consequences. But I think it's I think that China should work closely, with the European Union and all the other major.
To utilize the multilateral mechanism, you mean?
Yes. Okay. To rely upon the multilateralism, combat unilateralism of the United States. So I think that is the right choice for us. So I think when we make reactions to the Trump's policies, and we should ensure that is in the confines of the WTO rules. I think that's important. Otherwise, they will give the trade protectionists in U.S. and more excuse.
So, Professor, you're talking about utilizing the multilateral mechanism. What could be some things that could be instrumental, just as you put it that way, instrumental at hand right now?
Well, for example, the accusation, the whole base for the retaliation is based on accusations that China has stolen and shall continue to steal technology from United States. Okay, under WTO there is TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property protocol. So, okay, has a U.S. company really claimed that they are being forced, or they are being cornered to transfer their technology, and so they can really launch a lawsuit. So you can't say, okay, I think, or I hire a third-party agent to probe into a question that they come up with an impression rather than really a justifiable conclusion. So that's number one. Number two is that, okay, how many of those technologies are really already off-shelf? So simply by talking in the dark, oh, I just feel that you have stolen our technology up to $500 billion. So that's really groundless. If we really put this under a proper, a justifiable platform, so that really can evaporate. So that's why Donald Trump tries to avoid a third-party platform.
Basic principle is that if you want to talk, you have to keep your word, right?
You have to keep your word, and also you have to bring up the facts.
Thank you very much. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.